Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Sergio Caltagirone, and I am joined here by Sherrie Caltagirone. We'll just do some quick introductions first, but welcome to the first joint webinar between the Threat Intelligence Academy and the Global Emancipation Network. And here we're going to be talking about a very cool but unfortunately very sad, kind of aspect of cybercrime, which is the element of human trafficking that is used to enable and facilitate, both enable and facilitate cybercrime, as well as how it enables and facilitates human trafficking. So these two unfortunate, terrible topics kind of intersect in a strange and awkward way that is causing damage and danger to multiple types of victims in this space. So and there are lots of types of victims when you talk about this intersectionality between these two. So I introduce myself, I guess, and then I'll hand it over to Sherrie. My name is Sergio Caltagirone, and I am a cyber threat intelligence analyst, and I've been running cyber threat intelligence teams for 20 odd years now and studying cybercrime, cyber threats, state-sponsored threats, and kind of the whole spectrum of cyber security related issues. I just tangentially touch on human trafficking as I provide some technical support to the Global Emancipation Network. And basically, most of my time is actually spent teaching people threat intelligence. So how do you find, uncover, track, and ultimately understand how to mitigate cyber threats? So I'll be talking about the cyber threat component and the cybersecurity component of the activity today. But I'm going to hand it off to Sherrie, who's going to introduce herself and get us started on what is arguably the more challenging, difficult, and more humanitarian, and the larger humanitarian issue in this topic.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be doing this today with Sergio. This is the first time that we've really brought our two subject domains together for the public. But Sergio, as he just mentioned, has been doing this sort of work his entire career. I've done counter-human trafficking work throughout mine. And we've really sort of influenced each other in ideas in the past 20 years over that. And we found it very fascinating, the intersection of the two. So really excited to be doing this webinar today. I'm the founder and executive director at Global Emancipation Network, which is a US-based nonprofit that's dedicated to ending all forms of human trafficking all over the world using a data and technology approach. And we do all kinds of interesting projects, some of which I'll share with you a little bit in here. What we're really looking at then is countering human trafficking in all of its different guises. And it really does have lots of different ways of existing on the internet. Let me just tell you a little bit about human trafficking then, just from a high-level overview. Trafficking at its heart is really the exploitation of one person to benefit another person, usually financially, but there are some other ways of doing it. And usually requires force, fraud, or coercion are the three key words, but that doesn't exist when you're talking about children. It's automatically trafficking, or some people use the term modern slavery when it involves children. The estimates really vary quite a lot. You'll see some people mention a number that's around 25 million, up to this number that's on this slide, which is 46 million. And that's over, that's like 100% margin of error. So that's just pointing out one of the issues that we have and why a data and technology approach is so necessary here. That it's really difficult for us to count how big of a problem this is, and so that we know where to best apply our resources. It is at least a $150 billion industry worldwide. It's likely quite a bit more than that. It's at least the second most profitable crime globally, probably just behind drug trafficking. The numbers in the bottom bit here are taken from the U.S. Trafficking in Persons report that came out in 2022. It usually is released every July. And you can see the issue here. If we have anywhere from 25 to 46 million victims, and that has resulted in only around 5,000 convictions last year, less than 100,000 victims identified. You can begin to see how much we are still grappling with this problem. And it's still a really difficult thing for us to sort of combat in a holistic way, looking across the spectrum. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more too, how you can use this sort of analytic framework to help you know better where to have an impact. So now that I told you a little bit about what trafficking is, let's talk about what it isn't. This is a really fantastic graphic that's actually put out from the U.S. Health and Human Services Department. And it really sort of identifies some of the main myths that people think about human trafficking. A lot of people have probably seen the movie Taken by Liam Neeson, and it's a great visual. Everyone loves the idea of someone who gets kidnapped, then sort of the knight in shining armor comes in and rescues someone, and that's trafficking. That's really just the rarest scenario for what trafficking is. Some of these you mentioned, or that are mentioned here, is that sex trafficking is the predominant form of human trafficking. It's certainly the one that we have better data on, and so you'll often see it discussed more. And in some estimates, you will see people say that sex trafficking is more prevalent. But I agree actually with this infographic here that actually points out that forced labor is far and away the bigger issue. It's just a lot more difficult to get data on. The second one that is mentioned here is that victims will self-identify. And this is the one that is really difficult for people to grapple with, in that if you're being exploited, beaten, coerced into doing something against your will, you're going to sort of recognize that something is wrong. But that's truly not the case, especially because the main way that people are actually kept in trafficking is through psychological sort of control and manipulation. Very few people will ever say, I'm a victim of human trafficking, please help me. And the other thing I'd point out is that trafficking survivors, as we usually refer to them, don't really need us to rescue them. They're usually very capable of doing that. We just need to support them. As it points out that over 50%, I've seen as high as 80% of victims have had interaction with healthcare professionals. They've been into emergency rooms or seen doctors, things like that. And the identification in those healthcare settings is extremely low. This one says none. I think I've seen in a few cases where people have been identified and set aside, usually through domestic violence screenings. The other bit here, which is that human trafficking is not in my community. I also see the other side of my city, insert whatever name it is here, is really big for human trafficking. But really it's everywhere. And there's so many different forms, as we've already talked about, between, forced marriages, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, organ removal. It's all sort of across the board, that it exists literally every single place, every town, every state, every country. And in some cases out in the middle of the ocean too. So it is everywhere. And there are some interesting places where there seems to be more per capita than in others, but you can assume that there's a pretty decently even spread everywhere. I won't go ahead and read this whole thing, since, as Sergio said, we're going to be actually sharing this slide deck afterwards, so I can let you sort of marinate on some of these. A couple of others that I would point out, that Sergio and I, we have 4 children, and so we're often thinking about how we can best protect our children. This is true for all sorts of child abuse and exploitation scenarios. But truly, the people who are most likely to prey on your children are people that they actually know. It's not usually strangers. This is going to be, the soccer coach who lives down the street, a cousin, an uncle, a family friend, things like this. The situation where that's not necessarily always true is that there is a lot of child sexual exploitation that is grooming through the online environments, and we're going to talk about some of that too. Interestingly, the majority of sextortion victims are actually boys as well, which a lot of people don't realize. We think a lot about how to share with our girls that they shouldn't be sending pictures of themselves, inappropriate photos of themselves, to people that they know or don't know online. But actually, the most victims are boys. So I want to also take this second here. Please jump in with any questions. I know we'll leave some room for questions and answers at the end. But I really enjoy it when it's more of a conversation than just a one-sided bit too. The chat is also open, and the questions and answers, Sergio, I think that's true anyway. So please do take advantage of those features too. All right. We're going to be moving toward this direction of the intersection of technology and trafficking. But first, I want to give you a little bit more of a timeline for what this looks like in a legislative environment. Beginning in 1948, this is when the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, was established. Moving forward in time, you start to see, again, a little bit more, and this is, again, post-actual like the abolition of legal slavery around the world too. So this is in the modern days too. The most important or relevant piece of legislation that came out in the United States and has really shaped the internet as we know it today is the Communications Decency Act, specifically Section 230, that was authored by Senator Ron Wyden out of the state of Oregon in the US in 1996. And this is sort of what allowed the internet to be what it is, where the people who are hosting at the ESPs are not actually responsible for the content on it, and allows you and I to have conversations and share our YouTube videos, and basically protects those ESPs from liability for third-party content. And this is becoming more and more relevant. I started doing counter-trafficking work in 2004. And so this is just a few years after the UN Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, which was a supplement to a larger transnational organized crime bill. The same year, it was part of the US legislative agenda as well. And there was a bill that came out and was ratified that's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And you see in here there are several different reauthorizations that happen over the years on it, and it just continues to shape both funding and legislative priorities in the US and abroad. Now, the US, even though this is very heavy US-centric, are far from the only ones who have tried to tackle this issue, and perhaps maybe not even the ones who've been doing it the best. Moving forward a little bit, you'll see a couple of other bills that I want to point out. In 2015, there was the United Kingdom's Modern Slavery Act, which was really foundational in many ways because it started reminding businesses, or actually obligating businesses, to disclose their supply chains and specifically trafficking or modern slavery in the supply chains for companies over a certain size with a certain amount of revenue. They've just tightened this act up, but this was really the first time that businesses have been given sort of the shot across the bow that they are responsible for trafficking on their platform, services, and goods. More recently in the United States, we have the Stop Enabling Sex Trafficking Act, and sort of the other version of it, which was FOSTA. And I should remember what that is exactly stands for, but this is the bill that came out just after Backpage, which was a sex trafficking advertising website, was shut down. And this is, again, sort of taking a shot at the Communications Decency Act that was 20 years prior to that, and saying that you might have immunity for third-party content, but you're also responsible to scan and moderate content as well. So it opened up civil and criminal liability for trafficking-related content. And this sort of dialogue is continuing in here. We do see now in 2020 the EU e-privacy directive out of the European Union, which is sort of part of the larger conversation around GDPR and privacy and data protections online. But then, of course, it does also have repercussions for the trafficking situation. And then this is a link that I will point you to. It'll be available for you, but the online safety bill is also currently before the UK Parliament, and is going to be very interesting, again, for making sure that the internet is a safe place for everybody. Sergio, are you monitoring the questions and answers? I see a couple up there.
So Sherrie, I'll answer them verbally, or ask them verbally for you, so that everyone, especially on the recording, can get them. Do online sextortion, and again, I think if you could just define that quickly for the audience, does online sextortion happen in gaming platforms?
Fantastic. Absolutely. So sextortion is usually when somebody sends sexually explicit content, videos, pictures. It can even be text exchanges as well, where the person who's the recipient of those uses that material to blackmail the sender for it. So a sort of typical scenario would be when, let's say that I sent somebody a picture of myself in a sexually explicit manner. And then that person said, I'm going to share these photos with you, your family, your school, whatever, unless you give me more material. Or on the other side, unless you pay me an exorbitant sum of money. And it keeps people trapped in this of continuing to send material. Sometimes it is just material and it ends up being posted on oftentimes adult content websites, porn sites, and that sort of thing. And usually it's actually both, they get the financial incentive as well. I'm going to share an interesting case of ransomware that was associated with a sextortion scheme as well later. But to your exact question, yes, absolutely, it does happen on gaming platforms. And the best organization who's doing really great things on this site, I'll give you a couple. If you want to equip yourself with more specific knowledge on sextortion schemes, where some of the grooming is happening and what you can do about it, conversations to have with your children, Thorn. They do also have a platform that's called Safer that is trying to work with lots of different companies to moderate that sort of content before it actually becomes a problem. And then the other one particularly for Europe is the Internet Watch Foundation, IWF. So I will make sure and take a note that we send out some of these resources afterward to everyone.
Great. A second question. This is one that I know you and I have been discussing for several years and has been the subject of quite a bit of research. So since cryptocurrency has become widespread, obviously in the last 10, 12 years, have you seen more or fewer instances of trafficking incidents leaning on anonymous funding methods?
So there are entire organizations who've really focused on this specific question. One of them is the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative in the US is a big one, who's been looking at the use of cryptocurrency and trafficking. Another organization that is called Stop the Traffic. They have a fantastic tool that's called the Traffic Analysis Hub. Is less on cryptocurrency. There is that element, but really in tracing money and remembering that trafficking is a financial market, basically. And then being able to sort of add feet to the fire, or fire to the feet of the traffickers anyway, using financial mechanisms. So I'm going to give what's probably a somewhat unpopular answer here. And that back before 2018, before FOSTA SESTA, we were starting to see some use of cryptocurrency in sex trafficking advertisements. And it was because those websites were actually shut off from the sort of big international banking systems. Backpage is a great example of that. So we began to see ads being placed using cryptocurrency. And there was one researcher who's now at Thorn again, who did a really interesting experiment of tracking wallets, cryptocurrency. I think it was specifically Bitcoin wallets, and then sort of figuring out what the value of an ad was, figuring out what the lag time was when an ad is put up and whatnot, and then being able to track certain wallets specifically to individual sex trafficking advertisements. And there was some really cool work on that. That said, I really don't see a lot of cryptocurrency being used in this space. I do think that on the dark web, when it's just child sexual, I say just, that sounds terrible. When it is solely child sexual abuse material, I do think that there is some cryptocurrency exchange happening. But for the most part, we're still talking about cash, legitimate banking, environments, still the Western unions and the money trading sites. First and foremost. So the numbers that I showed you earlier about just how few convictions and prosecutions there are, I think is part of why we still see more traditional financial mechanisms being used. Sergio, did you have another response to that about cryptocurrency? You're probably better versed than I am in that particular space.
I think it's interesting that one thing that's interesting is that the wall of anonymity in crypto has been kind of broken. It used to be the case 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there was this myth of anonymity in cryptocurrency. But I think that as we've, specifically those of us like Global Emancipation Network and Thorn and others have explored this space, because obviously it was a big deal for everybody, especially in the criminal space. The FBI went after this really hard, Department of Justice, UK crimes agency and stuff like that. Like everyone went after it because we were like, oh, there's a way that they can bypass all of our, monetary legislation and monitoring, which honestly was put in place to monitor for fraud and abuse and coercion and things like that. That's why a lot of the fiscal measures are in place to monitor all of this. But I think very quickly, one thing that most people recognized was that the transparency that cryptocurrency boasts about is also the thing that gives us as investigators the greatest power over it. And they're really, and I hate to say this, but there's very little to no privacy on the internet, which everyone on this call probably understands. That if somebody really wants to know about what a wallet is doing, who's using this wallet and what's going on, and you can see all of this from all of these, cryptocurrency scams and people trying to figure out where did the money go and stuff like that. Almost all the time they find out. It takes some time. It's not instant. It's not perfect. But there really isn't. It's a very thin veil of anonymity. And so I think most criminals have now understood, just based on the usage of investigators to go after people using cryptocurrency, doing it effectively, that it's not the easiest thing to do. It is a good way to add another barrier to an investigator, but it is by far not the silver bullet of anonymity. And so I think a lot of criminals have decided it's not what they were looking for, because it's just so much harder. And honestly, if it adds more cost to their operations, but it doesn't really provide a lot of value, they're just going to, as Sherrie said, they're going to go back to Western Union and some other, traditional financial means of doing such a thing. So, Sherrie, another question is there a preferred platform for offenders, and what are the top platforms used?
It's really all of them, which is terrible. If it is connected to the internet and allows particularly for people to interact with each other, assume that there is at least some level of recruitment and grooming taking place on that platform. And that's terrifying. The other one that I would say to be aware of is any of the encrypted apps, the WhatsApp, Snapchats, Signal, Kik, any of the messaging services that tend to be encrypted. Those are really massive. And that's particularly problematic because, of course, law enforcement or other investigators don't have the same level of insight into what happens unless they're able to get disclosure on those accounts. I even have said that there's lots of trafficking activity on common sites that you and I use, and I'll show you an example here, but even sites like, Google reviews or Yelp, you'll see evidence of trafficking on those sorts of really common platforms. So in truth, you see it everywhere. It's TikTok, it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's Instagram, it's all the gaming environments. And that's a terrible answer to give to somebody, particularly parents, I know, but that's the truth of it.
Okay, so let's take this one last question here, and because it does pertain to this particular slide. I see most of the legislation on the timeline is in a limited number of countries. Are there effective mechanisms to combat human trafficking in Cambodia and other countries where prosecution may not be a priority?
That's fantastic. And I should have said disclosure, this graphic here I created for a very particular audience on this. So there's a couple of other bits you see, like the League of Arab States and the Arab Convention. And I had those on there because I was involved in writing those in particular. But there is counter-trafficking legislation in place in almost every country around the world. So as you pointed out, the problem really isn't that there's not good legislation. It even will follow the best practices. It'll be looking at the 3 Ps, protection, prevention, prosecution. But the political will isn't always there in order to combat it or to actually use it. And that's true within the US and the UK, which you see most heavily represented here as well. So I wish I had a better answer for you. I can give you a little bit more if you follow up and email me. My email address is on the back. I can share with you a little bit more about the legislative scenario in Cambodia. It is interesting, and it's going to feature in a little bit on a couple of interesting use cases that we're going to talk about too. But it's usually not the situation that there isn't legislation. All right. We will pause again a little bit to answer some more questions as they come up. This is just sort of an overview of some of the projects that we do at Global Emancipation Network. One of them, again, is sort of this intersection of technology and trafficking, specifically looking at the largest face of sex trafficking. This is about the United States, but truly it's everywhere. And this is that businesses that are really brothels that are masquerading with a legitimate business front. And in this case, massage businesses. It's similar sometimes with nail bars or alcohol bars, things like that too. So very similar use case as well. But this is usually pretty shocking for people in the US that there are over 10,000 of these illicit massage businesses currently open in the United States with an estimated revenue of at least $2.5 billion. And there's some cool organizations who've been working to get that specific number by just tracking customers coming in and out and with the average sort of transaction cost on those. So it's absolutely massive. It is the biggest case of sex trafficking in the US. And usually there are these sort of pyramid of these businesses too. And that the one that you see that has the digital footprint is usually the storefront in this case. And these are advertised on sites like RubMaps, like this screenshot here, or on Yelp, on Google, and all the legitimate sites. But then they're also related to apartment and hotel brothels as well. And they will often, their owners will have other businesses that they manage or financially have control over. And so I think on this call, there are a couple of my fellow researchers who have been helping on this particular project out of North Carolina State University. And so I will make sure to send out a link to some of the research that we've done on this, particularly with natural language processing techniques and using ensemble models to recognize based on a review how likely a business is to be engaging in human trafficking. So this is a really cool emerging field, and it's applicable really to the next set of slides too. This is a little bit more actually on some of the digital footprint that you can really see online for massage businesses, but also for some of the others that are sort of parallel to that. But looking at a business, you can think most businesses have a website, which means you'll have DNS data and registration data. Most will have employees who are associated with them. For many of them, they might have a LinkedIn account that lists where they work, for example, and their previous other employees or employers as well. They'll have a business license, at least for the business itself, but perhaps also in the case for massage businesses, the therapists themselves might have to register as a massage therapist as well, depending on the jurisdiction. There might be license violations and adverse actions that happen there. And then from the customer perspective as well, how do you know if you're looking to buy sex somewhere or to basically partake in the services of a human trafficking victim? How do you know which businesses to go to? You go to the same ones that you use to pick out where to get takeout for dinner that night. And it could be Yelp, it could be RubMaps is a specific dark web website for this, rubmaps.ch, that people who are buying services in these can sort of go and visit and learn and talk with other buyers to understand about the people who work in there and what services they provide and whatnot. But you can basically make a sort of data map like this for any sector that you are interested in targeting and using an intelligence and technology-led approach for it. So just really wanted to show you this as an example of that. But then moving on, again, still focusing on the intersection of technology and trafficking, you can use these same sort of like risk classification methodologies to look at other sectors as well. On the left side, it's really looking at home healthcare, and the people who work in those are really susceptible to trafficking all over the world. This one is for Dubai and Abu Dhabi. I know it's quite prevalent in the US and the UK as well. I think it's probably everywhere. Anywhere where basically fairly low skilled labor is being used. You're looking at things, if you're using a natural language processing technique in order to identify these sorts of advertisements, you're looking at any of the words that sort of indicate recruitment or visa fees, any help getting through sort of the legal hoops and paperwork exercises that usually come with moving from one country to another, and job placement. Or we sort of probably all know about the modeling scams, where it's just, if it's too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. So that's a good example of that. In the middle, it's an interesting one from a digital footprint perspective. This is an advertisement that I found in Central California, where it was particularly advertising for the harvest of strawberries. As it came in on that. And this was, again, targeting the local migrant workers, some of whom were there probably not legally, and trying to make sure that they were being victimized and controlled by the local cartels there. But you see, particularly within the farm migrant communities who are used for agriculture, a good deal of exploitation. There's some interesting data that you can use to sort of aggregate and map a network of that one. And then on the right-hand side, this is a project that we were working on looking at, it seems absurd, but it's called sand mafias, where you, apparently the best sand is located from river deltas because it's still got sharp edges, it isn't too eroded from wind or waves. And so there are criminal organizations that actually will sort of maintain those rivers and deltas. And then sometimes it will have sort of the permission from a local government to extract a certain amount of sand from those pits or those deltas. Sometimes they won't, but they'll almost always exceed what they're supposed to be doing legally anyway. But we were basically saying, can we see evidence of slavery using satellite imagery? And this is sort of formed on the basis of some really cool work being done out of the University of Nottingham in the UK by a researcher called Dr. Doreen Boyd out of the Human Rights Lab. And she was looking particularly at finding brick kilns in India. So then we were trying to extend that with a new set of models to look at the signals, the visual signals for sand extraction and living on site and processing sand on that. So this is just a graphic sort of to show how that can look. And again, these are all just different ways and places where you can find signals of trafficking on the internet. There are a couple of other really interesting cases here that I want to point out. And I apologize just for how difficult of subject matter this one is. But given that I know that we have some people here who are interested in cybersecurity and some who are coming from more of a background like myself with human trafficking or child protection backgrounds anyway, there are some interesting cases here. On the left side here, this is the Buster Hernandez. He was known as Brian Kill online. This was a major case that broke. Maybe you don't remember these names. He was sentenced to 75 years in federal prison. But this case made enormous headlines because what he basically did was extorted people for their images, like we were talking about sextortion, and then basically ended up with saying that he was going to, I think it was planting bombs particularly, but it could have been just guns, I guess, at a couple of schools. And so this is why it also says cyber terrorist there too. And this was, I think, out of Maine. It was absolutely massive. And what was fascinating about it was that he had control over a couple of victims particularly, and was able to basically have her sitting in this town hall about the what was happening in the school and reporting back to him what was happening, what people were talking about in it. And this goes back to the psychological control and fear of traffickers that help people maintain the control and command of victims. So much so that he was able to respond in real time online to what was happening in this small town hall, and really made people think that he must actually be there in the audience. So it was an absolutely insane case. And what ended up becoming the most known fact about this one was that this was the case where a major ESP basically ended up paying a third party to create a backdoor exploit to help the FBI. So most of you cybersecurity people who are on this call here, you'll know exactly the case that I'm talking about then for that. So that one was really fascinating, had the elements of cybercrime and child sexual abuse sort of all wrapped up into one case. And luckily that he was able to be stopped. The one on the right here is another really interesting one. And this sort of goes back to this thing. There's this defense by people who are caught with possession of child sexual abuse material on it, where they say it's the hacker did it defense. And they basically say, I didn't go download these images. It was just malware. It was some piece of ransomware, whatever, that downloaded this material to my account, but it wasn't me, right? And there was this really famous case that was sort of an Android exploit. And it, as you can see, was called pornhub.apk. And Sergio, you could probably do a better job at explaining this one than I could anyways, but it actually downloaded something that looked like a Pornhub app onto a device. And it had a small number of files actually in it. So if you were to do the forensic analysis of it, you would actually find that the piece of malware itself, which was ransomware as a service, basically in this case, it asked payment for Visa gift cards. And then back to someone else's question about cryptocurrency, there was some of them that had Bitcoin demands in it too. But it actually had 4 different, I think it was 4, it might be 8, child abuse material images that were actually embedded in the APK itself. So when you sort of tracked it down and figured out what was put on it and followed it, you could see that these images were there. However, in the particular case where this one was sort of uncovered, it became pretty clear just using timestamps and some basic analysis then that you could figure out this is what pornhub.apk actually involved, the files that were downloaded to the machine. But all of these other images that came before and after, this was the guy legitimately downloading this material. So that one is fantastic from like at least a intersection of technology and trafficking point of view. And of course, it's fantastic because the guy was busted and he was sentenced to a pretty steep penalty in jail. The last one I'll mention here too, because it ends up being so relevant in CSAM cases, is that oftentimes in images, there are tiny glimpses or clues in the background of an image that sometimes, or maybe what the victim themselves might be wearing, or a reflection that's caught of the trafficker or the exploiter or offender. And that sometimes the investigators really need help from the public to actually identify those, and in turn then identify and safeguard the child. And so there's a really cool program that's called Trace an Object that's run by Europol and a group called In Hope. And so I would encourage all of you who really enjoy sort of the hunt and using your particular skill set to put it to good use, and make sure to check out this Trace an Object page and see if you ever recognize any of the objects that are there. You can subscribe to alerts as well. I think this is a good time. Sergio, were there any other questions or anything that you wanted to add on this?
I think the one question we didn't get to is, since crypto doesn't provide a great deal of anonymity and traditional banking and financial transactions are being monitored more heavily every day, are you starting to see more creative ways of moving payments and funds, such as gift cards, or methods with less oversight?
Certainly with the gift cards, yes. And we're going to talk about one case. Sergio is going to go into some detail with one that was using like fake brokerage accounts as well that you'll start seeing to gift cards, as you mentioned. But sort of going back to that, the majority of these sorts of crimes are still like, there's no punishment that ends up happening. They're basically getting away with it in impunity. They are still largely using legitimate financial instruments to make their money, and traditional like organized crime ways of laundering that money too. So as we get better, through FinCEN networks and SARs within banking and sort of the other legitimate mechanisms as well, we are going to absolutely start seeing people get more creative, and then we're going to have to figure out what we can do with that. I think that that's sort of the evolving situation of, being on the defender side against crime. That's true against all of them, that you're always sort of having to evolve your methodology. But I don't think by and large we're really there yet within the human trafficking domain. You still see it a little bit, and there are some ways that you can monitor that drift and change, but it isn't massive yet.
And Sherrie, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't human trafficking, isn't there a large amount of intersectionality with other crimes? And so a lot of these networks will have existing money mules and laundering operations and stuff, so that they do know how to operate kind of at least hidden, outside of the obvious areas of monitoring.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a term that we use, it's called polycriminality, and particularly with those large regional or international criminal organizations, like you said, they're highly organized. Some of them have a little bit more vertical or more horizontal structure, but they basically have a diversified portfolio. And it sounds terrible, but basically trafficking and other forms of exploitation are just one of the ways that the business knows to make money. And it's a good way, if you can think about it, because when you can only sell, a bag of drugs once, you can sell a human services over and over and over again. And so in that way, it's really lucrative. But they will usually have, like you said, all sorts of other ways that they're making money: drugs, weapons, terror, sort of, you name it. And they will have these established routes and methods for laundering money. All right, keep the questions coming. I'm loving it. Oops. Now let's start talking about this. What we've talked about so far is largely just how the internet is facilitating human trafficking. Now we want to sort of turn that on its head and think about how trafficking victims and trafficking operations and rings are being used to facilitate cybercrime. So this is where Sergio's expertise is going to become really fascinating here. But last fall, there was a major news article that broke that really surprised all of us, but is really just an extension. It's a new face on an old form of human trafficking, which is forced criminality. Forced begging, for example, used to be really big in the Middle East, where a trafficker would sort of control a certain number of victims, and they would literally have them out on the streets begging for money, right? This is the cyber version of that. So Sergio, I will actually kick it over to you for you to share with us a little bit more about the ProPublica article. Sure.
So, I've studied cyber threat actors for 20 plus years now. And, it never ceases to amaze me, the types and ways and scales and, different methods of operation in the cybercrime world, whether those are state operations, state associated operations, or, straight criminal operations. And, there's always a challenge in cybersecurity, or I should say cyber crime operations, is very much like cyber security. It's very labor intensive, and it's also very labor restricted, meaning they could only, really, cyber criminals can only do as much as the number of people that they have to run their operation. And running a cybercrime operation is fairly substantial in terms of the amount of knowledge and people you need to operate it. In fact, weirdly, way back in 2015, during the first attacks against Ukrainian power grids by the Russians, one of the reasons why the Russians could not take down the other substations around Crimea was because they didn't have enough operators to do it at the same time. They were only able to go after 2 or 3, not all 5, although they had plans to take all 5 down, but they were only able to get to 2 or 3 before they were basically discovered and kind of shut out at that point. So this is not unusual. So the question comes down to, where do you get your labor if you are running a cybercrime operation, especially one that requires a lot of work, basically? It's not just, as we call it, spray or pray or fire and forget kind of methodologies, but ones that actually need interaction with another person, especially a victim. Those are going to be that's going to be a lot of work. So how do we get there? So, if we, next, please. Okay, so here's a really, as Sherrie was saying, you can find ads of selling people on the internet if you know where to go. This stuff is not hidden. It's not on the dark web, at least not all the time. In fact, most of the time it's not. Why? Because again, as Sherrie pointed out perfectly, people just do not get prosecuted for this crime. So they don't need to stay hidden. There's not a lot of risk to them. So they will just openly advertise for human beings, very, very sadly. And here, this is, you know, people think that this kind of stuff ended like back in the 19th century or, you know, the 18th century. This didn't. The open selling of human beings still occurs. And you just got to go to the right marketplace for it. So here you can see some ads for people. And again, as Sherrie was saying, you can sell a person multiple times. So it becomes very lucrative. And of course, and in some of the research in this space has been that, you know, that the people who are not producing, I should say, I apologize, not the people, the victims who are not producing, the people who are enslaved, who are not producing, get resold over and over. And because they're making their money just by selling the person instead of by that person actually producing a substantial profit for them. So most of the people you see sold are going to be the quote unquote lower performers. That's kind of, if you want to look at the data, that's the way it goes. They keep the highest performers to themselves and they sell the other ones, which was kind of an outcome of the research that was done. Next. So here you can see this. We're just going to talk about one particular type here, which is called pig butchering scams. It's a very bad name for it. I mean, but it does work, which is it quote unquote, it's about fattening the pig before you butcher it. And we're talking about the end victims here, we're not talking about the enslaved persons, but the people that they are victimizing, that they are being forced into criminality to victimize. And so pig butchering is about getting a victim more and more attached so that they can do a very massive amount of crime against this person. It's not, hey, I took $100 from you. It's, hey, how can I steal your life savings? How can I take 200,000? Or there's even cases of millions of dollars being taken from these victims. So it's about a long-term relationship that these, enslaved persons build, again, in this case. So you can see here, $429 million just last year in this types of case, 4,300 self-reported victims. But interestingly, there's been a lot of research done in criminality, and only about 1% of scammed victims actually report their crime. So here you can assume that we're talking about the hundreds of thousands, just in the US alone, that are victimized by this type of crime. And of course, they primarily target financial transactions and financial account credential theft. So now let's go into the actual technical cybersecurity issues of how this occurs. So next. So we're going to use the kill chain to the cyber kill chain to kind of break down how this is occurring, how this cyber crime occurs. And then what we're going to do is that we're going to pivot back to Sherrie, who's going to talk about the people behind this, right? The enslaved people that are being forced into this kind of criminality. So next. So the reconnaissance is done first mostly by cell phones, by SMS text messages. I've gotten several of these pig butchering scam messages. I'll show them to you. I love using my own data of when people attack me to show how people do things. And so here, you just go and buy a whole bunch of active cell phone numbers. There's a lot of ways to do this. All I did was I went on Fiverr and I looked for it and it was right there. And you can see it's really cheap to buy people's cell phone numbers. So that's an easy way to get it. So the first thing you got to do is you got to find your victims, and that's just by buying cell phone numbers. Very cheap, doesn't barely cost any money. Next. Now you got to weaponize that data. So here you have to go acquire mostly iPhones. And the reason for it is because iPhones have the best message delivery frequency, meaning between an iOS or an Android, you tend to have different types of devices have better delivery, or basically responses or lower bounce effects. And iPhones tend to have the lowest. So plus they also get to use iMessage too for other iPhones. So they get the benefit of being kind of trusted inside the Apple ecosystem. So there's a lot of benefits of why they are just scooping up tons and tons of used iPhones. If you want to know where your used iPhones go, this is one potential path that they take to enabling this. And so then, of course, the attacker In this case, the person who is being forced into doing this has to then generate a message that is likely to elicit a response. They don't want to, they're not sending you a link to a piece of malware like a lot of them do. They're sending you a message that seems very innocuous, very kind. It's something that you would want to respond to, reasonably, like, oh, I'm sorry, you got the wrong number. No, this isn't John. This isn't who you're looking for. Something that would get you to just think, oh, this is nothing, just innocent. So that's how they begin the scam. Next. You can see here, I found a scammer, and as I do once in a while, I led them on for a little bit. I just like to see kind of where the threads tend to go. And so here you get one, and this was just very recently. This was last July. I got this scammer, and you can see I kind of led them on just a little bit here. And then you can see where I got them to was, okay, now they're gonna, they're gonna ping like, I live in the US, where are you? They're gonna start asking very, very personal questions. And if I had responded with some personal details, they would have just continued to funnel down that path to build a rapport. They may have even sent me family photos or doctored photos of people, right? And been like, oh, look at my kids, do you have kids? They start, that's the kind of relationship that they're building with you. And this is very likely an enslaved person that I'm speaking to on the other side of this conversation. And they are being held against their will, being forced to conduct this operation, and being held to financial obligations. So they have to make a certain amount of money every day. They have to have made a certain number of contacts. If they don't, they get beaten, killed, sold, a whole bunch of other, their families could be in danger, all of those things that happen to continue to entrap a human being in this. So you'll see this is a great picture from Vice News that they have from one of the trafficked persons. They took a picture of all the phones that they're under control of, and they showed you all of these different messaging threads that they're currently on the hook with. And of course, they just go buy new SIM cards. When a phone number gets blocked, because it will eventually, they just go buy a new SIM card using a gift card or a prepaid gift card to buy SIM cards, and they just plug a new SIM card into the phone, and they just continue to operate. So it doesn't take much to do this. Next slide. So now that they've got you hooked, right? Now you're like, oh, I care about you. You're a good person. I saw pictures of your kids, and all this stuff. Now what they do is they try to entrap you by getting you to be very interested in what they have to say. They're like, oh, well, you need a little bit of money. Guess what? I really know this little tiny company who, I'll let you get a little bit of, I'll let you have a little side hustle here. If you send them $100, I'll give you $1,000, right? And it doesn't sound weird at first. Like, in fact, they make it sound extremely legitimate. Like, oh, it's not a lot of money, but you're going to get a little bit of money out of it, and you get the money back right away. And so they'll start doing that, and they're going to send you to a website that looks very legitimate. 247stockexchange.com doesn't sound super weird in the world of domain names. It looks legitimate. And I'll talk a little bit about the technology behind this, but it doesn't give off any alarm bells. Next. Next, then, what they'll do is they're actually going to give you some money back. So when you give them some money, they're going to give you some of your quote unquote returns. And again, this is a very old time scheme, right? Like this type of operation, confidence schemes, as they call them, right, are very common. So they usually first elicit some personal details from you, family situation, financial situation, or they'll try to build some sort of romantic relationship with you. They'll try to find a vulnerability like your family, or like I said, if you're looking for some sort of romantic connection, then they're going to elicit some promise and say, oh, well, if you give me, or if you go into my friend's business for $100, he's going to be able to get you $500 back, but don't tell any. And then they're going to tell you not to tell anyone, right? Because we don't want a lot of people to know about this, right? And all that stuff. So they try to keep you quiet, right? Again, they're trying to entrap you into the scheme. Next. And then lastly, after they quote unquote fatten the pig with more trust and more reliance on them, then they're going to go after the big amount. So there they will probably then steal your financial credentials, take everything they've got from you. They'll get you to invest a whole lot of money. They'll steal your crypto wallet and drain it. Things like that are going to happen. And then they ghost the person, obviously, behind it. So this is if we go to the next slide. So most people are like, oh, I could totally see a scam if I saw it, right? And I can tell you, I can't, right? Not all the time. I'm really good at what I do. And I can tell you that there's a lot of ones that I even show Sherrie and I'm like, wow, this guy's really good. Like there's some really good ones out there. So what I did is I took 100 of the known scam sites involved in this type of operation. I simply just kind of did a very basic digital analysis of it. And I said, what is interesting about these? Is there anything here? So first of all, none of them classified as malware or had malicious behaviors. None of them were classified as malicious by Safe Search or other search classification engines. The infrastructure was all in legitimate sites, Namecheap, Cloudflare, AWS, all hosted on shared hosting sites that are legitimate, Wix and Fastly, all using legitimate TLS certificates for HTTPS, all the masquerades as legitimate financial services sites. So it didn't look weird. There was no link or redirect to other sites that you would normally see. You'd get to one site and it'd bounce you to some weird site, right? No, it was very, very clean operation. There was no advertising on the sites. They were optimized for mobile browsing, which is great for them. Obviously, most people are, especially if you're doing SMS, you're on your phone. So they know that the people are going to want to use the site on their phone. And I looked at the Java code and JavaScript code. It was all optimized for mobile browsing. So they know their audience. And then last, there were a few that were black-holed by Microsoft or Google. Clearly, Microsoft or Google had caught them as scam sites and had black-holed these sites. But by far, very, very few of them. So if you look at this in terms of how do we mitigate this from a cybersecurity perspective, you can see there's very, very little footprint here from how do I just identify a known bad from a known good. These sites don't really give us much in terms of our current set of heuristics that we utilize to identify these sites. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sherrie to go through the people behind this and then close it up.
Great. I know that we only have a few minutes left, and thanks all for hanging with us as we talk about this a little bit more. What Sergio was really going through, again, was sort of an analytic framework for understanding adversary behavior. And we've extended what was the military kill chain, the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain, that he was just talking about into the human trafficking domain, and really looking at the phased adversary approach: recruitment, transportation, entrapment, brokering, delivery, and exploitation. Not every trafficking situation will have every one of these phases. And the way it's presented here sort of looks more linear, but it's not perfectly that. There's going to be jumps down the chain to earlier. It sort of loops back around, particularly in the cases where victims are recruiting more victims. And so on. But using a situation or an analytic framework like this is always advantageous. And I'm just going to sort of very quickly highlight this, since it will be available in the slides afterward. I want to get to those questions in the Q&A function there. But again, really thinking through each one of those phases that the adversary goes through in order to exploit a victim to make the money, which is their end goal. And then you, as the defender or the person who's working to combat human trafficking, or on the other side, cybercrime, then what can you do in order to do it? And then really thinking, what is the strongest and longest lasting action that you can take, from detect, deny, disrupt, degrade, deceive, and destroy any way that you can use on that. So I'll just leave that as a little enticement. We do have a paper that we produced. It's on our website. And happy to send it to anyone who's interested as well, on how you can really go through sort of a trafficking report and a media article, or again, if you were looking with active cases as well, and how you can use this analytic framework to help you with that. I would be remiss if I didn't give some sort of pitch here at the very end. At Global Emancipation Network, we are always looking for volunteers to help us in our mission. Right now, we have a really cool victim identification tool set. I know one of my colleagues is here on the call for that. And we are going to be undergoing another major data collection phase for that. And with that, it's going to include a lot of labeling too. So I would love it if you're willing to help. We do have some other ML sort of image modeling needs as well. You could see some of the things that we get up to. One of them is looking at storefront imagery. We're continuing to satellite imagery as well. So we have a few needs on that. We have a lot of students that we work with as well. And this is part of what I think is important in terms of developing the next round of people who are in counter-human trafficking. And again, like remembering that you can do good with any sort of academic or professional career that you choose and getting involved in these Tech for Good efforts. So anyone who wants to help with student mentorship, I'd welcome you on that. And then we are sort of in the process of undergoing a website resource sort of renovation, if you will. And there's some cool things that we have on the back end, but could love some people with expertise in web design and content generation who can help us with that. And speaking of the website, if you enjoyed this talk and want to support our mission, we'd be really grateful if you would be willing to give a small donation in order to help us to continue to do some more of these efforts. The website is linked below, globalemancipation.ngo. Great. So let's get to some of these questions here. And I know that some of you are likely having to drop off as we do, but thank you so much for joining us in the meantime. Let's see. The first question is whether the latest actions that governments and NGOs are taking to address human trafficking around major sporting events such as the World Cup, Super Bowl, World Series, etc. This is a question that's asked a lot in this domain. And the interesting thing is that the data does not actually show that trafficking increases during these major events. It is sort of a misnomer. The interesting thing is that it gets more attention, and so more trafficking activity tends to just be investigated, and so you see more prosecutions or arrests happen. And there's also a bit of a conflation sometimes with I say just, it sounds terrible, so please take it with a grain of salt how I'm using my words here, but with commercial sex and human trafficking and these sorts of events too, where you see sort of John behaviors, and you see, for lack of a better word, sex workers being arrested at these sorts of events too, and it being conflated with trafficking. But there are lots of efforts in every country where World Cups are hosted, Super Bowl, all of those sorts of things, and you'll usually see it make headlines. So thank you very much for that question. The next one, Joseph asks, I've been hearing about pig butchering. Do the usury apps, sometimes found on the app stores, which give loans, then extort or blackmail victims with their private info, tie into the same network? I'll take a first stab at it, and then I'm going to kick it back to you, Sergio. I do know that the major operations that we're seeing right now that are engaged in pig butchering scams that are using trafficking victims are still coming out of Southeast Asia and some parts of Africa, like Nigeria. So I would need to know a little bit more probably and do some more research on the ownerships of these sorts of apps and be able to understand how they might tie into the same network. But it is clearly a winning methodology that criminal organizations are finding. So I assume that we really only know the tip of the iceberg and that there's a lot more footprint underneath that we just haven't figured out yet how it's connected. Sergio, did you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah. So as Sherrie said, I think the answer is we don't know. Not many people know, but that, as Sherrie was mentioning earlier, the polycriminality of these organizations will tend towards the hypothesis that yes, you will see similar operations, sextortions happen, just straight blackmail or extortion happen, not through these apps particularly, because these apps are actually very well designed that they're using for this type of operation. They're very well designed for just this, because again, if anything was weird, it might knock some victims off of it, right? Be like, oh, this is too weird, I'm not going to do this. So they're trying to keep it relatively clean, actually, I would say. That doesn't mean that the back end, the technical back end, is not interrelated or intertied. So we don't, but from the apps themselves, the ones that I've studied, the three that I looked at today and last week, and then some of the websites, it doesn't look like the apps are crossing over in different types of cybercrime. It looks like they're very focused on that one particular type of scam.
Awesome. Let's see, Jessica asks, since victim recruitment is often done online via ads, where do you see the majority of US-based ads posted? And are you seeing overseas ads mentioned moving to or working in the US? Fantastic. Now, the interesting thing that I mentioned is that with some of the legislation that we've seen that we talked about earlier, it's actually shifted what online behavior looks like. And we're continuing to see that with some of the heat that's coming out of the EU as well. So after FOSTA SESTA was passed in 2018, we saw a huge migration of these ad sites to the dark web into password protected subscription-based websites and moving their hosting out of the US jurisdiction and into Europe, particularly out of the Czech Republic and the Netherlands. So they'll sort of follow where everyone else is, where the least restriction is, where it's best from a jurisdictional perspective to defend themselves in a civil or criminal trial, things like that as well. So those are the two main trends that we're seeing, is that pushing it down into the dark web and moving it out of the US jurisdiction. There are some organizations I know that, like adult content websites, for example, who make sure to have no US footprint or as minimal as possible because of some of the things that they can get themselves into hot water of in the US. And I know that the same is true in the UK as well. So that's not just sort of the ad sites, it's sort of across the board, I think. Role as a defender, how can I contribute as a volunteer and from where can I start? Thanks so much. If you can email me, Sherrie at globalemancipation.ngo, I would love to get you hooked up and started as a volunteer. And then I think the last one that we'll take, but please feel free to continue to get in touch with us and engage in this conversation with us online, LinkedIn, Twitter, and whatnot, and just through continued efforts. This one says, have you noticed any interstate networks that have institutionalized working together on human trafficking and cybercrime? Also, is North Korea and China working on this? Asking because this is my research area and I haven't found any concrete verified data. Fantastic. I'm really interested in your research on that. So I think that you're probably interested in, Sergio, you can talk about state actors when it comes to cybercrime more broadly, and you do, of course, see the intersection of that. Interesting that you mentioned China. The form that I would say that seems to be, if not quite state-sponsored, but definitely willingness to look the other way, is particularly in organ trafficking. And interestingly enough, there are even American and European research hospitals that have facilities, particularly in China, even within the Uyghur region, where doctors are actually trained on how to do organ transplants really conveniently. So in that sort of case, absolutely. I haven't seen much from North Korea. You could certainly scan some of the Global Slavery Index or the US Trafficking in Persons report, and I'd be happy to look into it with you a little bit more if you want to send me an email. But I think less I see where governments are more actively involved in the trafficking. You do see some more, and it's usually not officially governments, it's more like militia groups that are sort of tangential to it, of things like child soldiering or situations where there are terror organizations who basically take up victims as well. And so you could make an argument that these are sort of interstate networks as well. Anything you want to add on to that, Serge?
I mean, on the traditional side, what we call state-tolerated operations, right, where there's cyber criminals who are operating, they're tolerated by the state. You see this a lot in China. You'll see this a lot out of Russia, and a lot of it out of post-Soviet states as well. And this is one where a lot of people question the intersectionality between states and non-state actors in cybercrime. And one thing you can really actually kind of get really good at is that it's not a rule, so please don't use it as a broad brush, but where there tends to be greater government corruption, if you just even follow the government corruption index, you will find greater tolerance.
Or human suffering more broadly.
Exactly. Yeah. You will find more human suffering, which includes more intersectionality with human trafficking and with cybercrime, if not tolerance, just straight, as we call it, moonlighting, where you have government officials also conducting this type of illicit operation, even if it's against the law. So in cybercrime, absolutely, we see this, and I would definitely expect it, in a large part of the world, actually.
Fantastic. I see a couple more questions popped up. I will send you an email for those, and we can continue that conversation. Thank you all for sticking with us. I know we went a bit over. Really appreciate this conversation. Great interactions. I hope that you found this useful, and we will be sending out this slide deck and some of the associated resources that we talked about. Thank you.
Thank you.